So it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, which is Dr. Andrew Gray. And Dr. Gray is an assistant professor of watershed hydrology in the Department of Environmental Sciences at the University of California, Riverside. He completed his PhD in hydrologic sciences at the University of California, Davis, where he focused on the sediment dynamics of small mountainous rivers. At UCR, Dr. Gray has built a research group that investigates the processes controlling water and sediment transfer, with particular interests in wildfire impacts on sediment dynamics and water quality, coastal sedimentology and geomorphology, as well as trash and microplastics pollution. And as an aside, I've been working with Dr. Gray for the past few years as I did my PhD at UC Riverside, and I will hand it over to Dr. Gray.
Great, thanks a lot, Scott. And it's a real pleasure to be here and have a chance to chat with you all. And it was great to hear about SFEI's study just before mine, which is at a much more mature stage, and we've certainly been using the lessons learned from their study to guide the work that we're doing. Can everybody see my shared screen for my slides?
Looks great.
Great. So today I really just want to kind of focus in on microplastic fate and transport in watersheds and highlight some of the monitoring needs that we've identified and are trying to answer through our work to better support the kinds of data analysis and modeling that we want to do to better understand fate and transport. First, I'd like to thank all the students in my lab that are really in the trenches, in the channels, on the bridges, in the laboratory doing all of this work. They've been working very, very hard and continue to do so as we move towards the wet season, which always gets really crazy for us. So I wanted to start off with a note from Earth's surface processes because that's my background. I'm a hydrologist and geomorphologist, and I really specialize in natural sediment transfer in watersheds and coastal oceans. And really, I came to microplastics with the perspective that they're really just another kind of particle that's moving through the Earth's system. And their closest natural analogs are the finer fractions of mineral and organic sediments that we find throughout watersheds in the Earth's system. And these sediments are commonly transported in suspension by rivers. And for that reason, we can use established approaches for analyzing and modeling and monitoring the source, fate, and transport of suspended sediment to then guide our approaches for microplastics. And so, as we think about microplastics in watersheds, why would we decide to monitor those microplastics in stream flow rather than, say, perhaps starting out with a much more distributed fashion across the watershed? There's a number of reasons for this. One of them is that, the efflux of microplastics from stream flow is the source or the boundary condition for the next receiving body downstream. A lot of this work on microplastics was really engendered by initial interests in microplastics contaminations in the marine environment. And then identification of rivers as a primary source has pushed even more of that work upstream and into the fluvial system. Also, by studying microplastics in the river, we're gaining understanding of potential impacts on that sampled reach and associated systems. And then we can also use that sampling and monitoring and then modeling within rivers to help us begin to start deciphering upstream controls related to the source, transport, and transformation of microplastics through the watershed. And so, as I mentioned, watershed microplastics are like natural fine sediments in many ways. We know and we suspect and largely know that they're dominated by non-point sources at this point, in part due to the efforts of SFEI and many others. Microplastics are everywhere. Of course, point sources are potentially very important because in some places you have much higher concentrations of microplastics that are being introduced to the environment. We also know that fundamentally, the introduction of microplastics into the channelized system of a watershed, it's a transport limited phenomena when we're on the hillslope, when we're outside of the channel on these terrestrial surfaces. But once we get into the channel, this is primarily a supply limited phenomena, which means that most channelized flow can move most microplastics. Now, there's many different ways in which microplastic sourcing and transport can differ systematically from natural sediments, such as, we expect shallow surface abundance on hill slopes or these terrestrial surfaces rather than ubiquitous sediment supplies throughout soils and across the earth system as we have for natural sediments in some cases. We also expect to find much more of them in urbanized systems, and this has been borne out through a lot of initial monitoring, and also washing off of impervious surfaces, which tend to actually shut down the supply of natural mineral sediments. And there's other systematic differences in source mobilization and exhaustion thresholds. And also, when it comes to microplastics, we potentially have a better shot at utilizing the plastic particle characteristics to give us an idea of source than we may have for a lot of mineral and even organic natural sediments. So as we move into the channel itself and thinking about how microplastics are transported in rivers, as Dr. Lin mentioned, we're really dealing with particles that are moving through rivers, so they're not necessarily being transported in a fully mixed fashion throughout the flow field or in this two-dimensional representation down through the water column. This introduces complications for monitoring, and it also has important implications for transport. One of the important implications for transport is that it solidifies the idea that we're dealing with a supply-limited phenomena in the channel. Most of these particles that are moving as suspended load with our natural analog the flow could potentially transport tremendous amounts more than we almost ever find in the channel. And that's also certainly the case for all the microplastics that we're dealing with under most flow conditions, rather than transport limited conditions where you're dealing with larger materials that are much more difficult for the flow to move and can only move during higher discharges. So this has implications for not only how microplastics move through rivers, but also how we can utilize samples collected from rivers to better understand the sources of microplastics in rivers as well. Another point to make in terms of downstream impacts on the next receiving body, in this case, sort of the ultimate sump, which is the world's oceans. When it comes to terrestrial sediments and their flux from the continents into the world oceans, that flux is really dominated by active margins. So areas where you have lots of uplift that's generating young mountain ranges, generating a lot of sediment supply. That's then that supply is then moderated by transfer through watersheds, and small mountainous watersheds then become the most effective supply and transfer agents because you have less of this internal storage in floodplains to hold that sediment back in part. Plastics, and this diagram from Meyer et al. 2021, this is focused on bulk plastics rather than just on microplastics, but as we know through particle size scaling, et cetera, that these patterns you would expect to be relatively similar. These are the results of, in both of these cases for natural sediment and for plastics, this is a result of some monitoring, a tremendous amount of more monitoring for natural sediments than for plastics, but still monitoring that's then being utilized through empirical models to estimate these fluxes. With plastics, this empirical approach has tended to utilize the human population as the engine of supply, which you would expect. And then we have the watershed as a moderator for transfer, but also solid waste management as well. One thing I want to just point out briefly in this talk is that in both cases, we tend to monitor, when we are monitoring the flux of these materials through rivers, we tend to monitor upstream from tidal influences, from coastal marine influences in the rivers for reasons related to being able to accurately characterize flux. But there are potential, there is processing of these sediments within the coastal marine zone, within estuaries, and this is something that has been studied for a long time for natural sediments, but still remains a problem for closing down some of these budgets, and it's also a need for microplastics at this time as well. So when we think about monitoring in rivers, Dr. Lin already went over this in great detail, but the point that I want to really make is that we need dynamical or flux-based monitoring rather than ambient characterization. I'm not saying, and so by ambient characterization, I mean going in and dipsticking a stream, just measuring concentration or character in the absence of monitoring the flux of water through the river, the discharge of water. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that at all, but we have a much greater need for monitoring microplastics concentrations when we're also monitoring discharge. One, because this allows us to estimate flux for that instant or time period of monitoring, but it also gives us the tools to start moving into empirical approaches for estimating and predicting flux, and then also moving upstream to consider the dynamics of the watershed supply and transport continuum. So as we start thinking about monitoring a little more, and I'll go through this quickly since this has already been covered, but really in keeping on with this comparison to natural sediments, microplastics have a much broader range of particle characteristics than natural sediment. We see a broad range of characteristics with natural sediments, particularly if you go across the mineral to organic spectrum. But with microplastics, we're talking about a wide range of sizes, a tremendously wide range of shapes, because we also have films and fibers that can be very prevalent, but also a wide range of densities, which leads to dealing with particles that fall within this suite of contaminants that are, some are strongly negatively buoyant and some are strongly positively buoyant, which is very different than what we find with natural sediments, which are mostly negatively buoyant. And so for this reason, when we start looking at where we find these microplastics within the flow field of the channel, within the cross-section of the channel, if you're thinking about it three-dimensionally, if we go through and plug in the boundaries of size of microplastics, of the full range of densities that we expect to find, and then the wide range of commonly encountered flow characteristics, because these are the major aspects that conspire to determine where we will find these particles in the water column in a river. If we go through and do this work, and this is work that was published by Wynn Cowger from my group back in just this past year, what we find is that we would expect to see microplastics actually moving through the river under all different modes of transport that we've identified for microplastics. So that includes, in some cases, for some extremely low energetics in the flow field, bed load or even immobile microplastics in some cases, but settling suspended, which we commonly find with mineral suspended sediment, and then on into surface load, where we find most of the plastics at the surface, or rising suspended, where we have higher concentrations towards the surface for those low density plastics that have a positive buoyancy, as well as wash load, right? Particularly as we move into the finest fraction, where we have fully mixed and uniform concentrations across the flow field. So that means that really, if we do want to try to wrap our arms around the full diversity of microplastics and flows that are possible, that will require flow integrated sampling. But that's not always our goal, and that's something that we really need to think about as we move forward with monitoring microplastics. And if we're focusing on things, say, that we know we'll find in wash load through simple fluid mechanics calculations, then it makes sampling much, much, much easier. So as we move into what we can do with some of this monitoring, we have various watershed modeling approaches as we start to get at estimating abundance and flux and predicting it as well. So, a very commonly used approach in hydrology are these physics-based distributed hydrologic models. These are models that have very high data demands for appropriate calibration and validation in order to predict abundance and flux. But without full calibration and validation, they can be used to provide insights into system function, right? And I think that's really where these kinds of more sophisticated models can make are starting to make and will continue to make their initial contributions to the field, rather than by trying to use them to actually estimate and simulate abundances and flux in the systems that we're studying right now, because we just don't have enough monitoring, and I don't think that we will for a while, if ever. The other real benefit from these is that you can eventually use them to simulate unobserved phenomena if you have enough monitoring. The other approach is empirical, so it's using rating curves, which I'll go into in a second, or lumped or even semi-distributed models. These require less data. We can still derive some insights. As you start moving into fully unobserved phenomena, they can be problematic and very limited. But I'll move forward with mostly focusing a little here on empirical models, because that's the initial approach that we're taking. So as we move into empirical microplastics flux dynamics, the starting point is really, again, flux-based monitoring, right? Where we're monitoring concentration. That's what you're seeing here on the y-axis. This is all log transformed, and discharge. This is a suspended sediment concentration rating curve, and this bivariate space, which is the most common empirical approach that's used for taking monitoring data at a station on a river for suspended sediment, and then moving forward by utilizing primarily discharge monitoring alone in order to predict microplastics concentration and flux, right? And this is what we're starting to do with microplastics as well. It's the beginning of modeling, essentially, for fluvial particulate transport. And so there's the details that go into this, but essentially, because we're dealing with primarily a supply limited phenomena, you might ask, well, why is there such a large dependence, in this case, of suspended sediment concentration on discharge? That's because the same internal and external factors, so by internal I mean watershed characteristics, and by external I mean exogenous factors like climate and human forcings, et cetera. The same factors are conspiring to, in a lot of ways, influence the supply of water to the channel, that also influence the supply of sediment to the channel. And we expect that this is also largely the case with microplastics, although we think it will also systematically differ, and we're already seeing some evidence of that. And so for that reason, microplastic concentration then has a lot of residual dependence on discharge. Now, we can utilize that primary dependence in order to help us estimate flux, and think so that we can estimate what's happening when we're not monitoring at our station, and then also, what our fluxes are to the next downstream body. But we can also then go back and further interrogate these data to help us better move upstream and understand something about these forcing factors that are conspiring to introduce water and, in this case, microplastics to the channel. So if we look at suspended load transport in rivers, particularly as you move into the small mountainous rivers that are typical here in California, or draining a lot of California anyway, we see huge ranges in concentration. If you consider the entire range of discharge magnitudes that are sampled, it's very common to see 4 orders of magnitude of variability in suspended sediment concentration. And then even after we go through and fit a rating curve, which is our best first simple empirical step to being able to estimate concentration through discharge, we often will have some on the order of magnitude on either side of that fit of variability. And so, as we start to look into plastics, this is some work from Win Calgar again in my group that's in review currently. This is actually work in the Santa Ana River on fine macroplastics, so the above 5 millimeters, but not too much larger than that. These are count-based concentrations. Here again, we have discharge on the x-axis. Both are, log space. This preliminary analysis, if you go through and fit a more complex model to this, you can make it fit pretty well, and it looks like it's relatively tight. But if you're going to try to fit a power law relationship, which is this log linear relationship we see here, you see a lot of variability as well. And so this is further caution against ambient monitoring, because we have we know we have so much variability across the discharge domain, but even within any given discharge magnitude as well. We expect to find that, and we're starting to find it. Other complications include hysteretic behaviors. So this is path dependence, which can also be further generalized to temporal dependence. Many of you are really familiar with this at the seasonal scale. First flush dynamics, especially here in these dry summer Mediterranean climatic regimes that we experience in California, you have this entire dry period where very little, where no rainfall runoff and fluvial activity is happening. And so oftentimes during the first flush, the first sort of effective rainfall runoff event of the season, we see very, very large concentrations in many fluvial constituents, particularly particulates. We've expected to see that for microplastics. With some of our initial findings here for coarse macroplastics, we're not. If you look at the dates on some of these, we see actually higher discharge magnitudes earlier in the season with lower concentrations. We see some initial evidence for other scales of hysteretic behavior, such as rainfall runoff event, hysteresis. This is the difference in concentration as you move up and then down the hydrograph. So same discharge on either side of the hydrograph, but very different concentrations. We don't have enough monitoring yet to really document that, but we see it sort of pasted across the larger scale. And we expect to find more of it for a number of reasons that I won't go into now. But the takeaway from all of this is that with these kinds of additional dependencies on time and path, it increases our monitoring demands to adequately characterize dynamics, even for these simple empirical approaches. So if we move beyond the simplest of empirical methods and move into the next step of complexity is lumped empirical modeling. That this relies on watershed composition, hydrologic regime, et cetera. These are the kinds of models that are being used to estimate global fluxes of plastics, and people are starting to use this for microplastics as well. You can then use this to predict the abundance of flux in unmonitored watersheds. But it requires that you go through and monitor many watersheds that represent a wide range of compositions and hydrologic regimes. And then you can utilize that to develop some kind of empirical model. And that is one of the ways forward, so that we don't have to go through and monitor every single watershed. And we already have inklings and indications of this, that we'll find much more microplastics, say in watersheds that are highly urbanized versus or highly impacted by agriculture versus undeveloped. But we need more work so that we can actually move forward with this approach. And that's one of our goals in my lab as well. Beyond that is, to better inform lumped approaches, or even move into semi-distributed empirical approaches that will require finer scale subbasin analysis and even source evaluations. People are, of course, working on this already, and this will help as we move towards potentially these more complicated models. It involves interrogating major point sources, even looking at hill slope to subbasin specific studies, and also trying to close in on additional transport processes that are introducing microplastics to our watersheds or channels or aquatic systems, including aeolian transport processes, which may be quite important. So to wrap this up, and to really focus on the needs and recommendations for microplastics monitoring, we need to do more monitoring in estuaries, both water and sediment, to better understand the processing of microplastics as they move through this transitional zone between the fluvial and coastal marine environment. We need to focus on flux-based monitoring of microplastics in stream flow, and we should focus on storm flow. And I didn't go into this as much, but as we think about effective discharge of sediment in the kinds of systems that we're dealing with for natural sediment, effective discharge, which are the ranges of discharge that transport most of the sediment, is mostly higher magnitude, lower incidence, so lower frequency discharges. We expect that won't exactly be the case for microplastics, but that storm flow itself will be much more important than lower flows, base flows, or some of these urban drool or wastewater return flows. We need further investigation of microplastics transport dynamics in stream flow in coastal marine environments, which means directly investigating differences in concentration and character across the water column. And that can then go on to help inform local impact assessment and flux predictions as well. And we need more information on what classes of microplastics to prioritize so that as we move beyond academic research groups such as my own and others that really specialize in sediment monitoring in rivers, that we can go and advance techniques for monitoring that are easier to implement, less effort and equipment intensive, and can hopefully piggyback off of infrastructure that's already in place in a lot of these rivers for monitoring other constituents. And then we really need, moving beyond that, and well, I guess that's the next point, right? That we need representative streamflow monitoring. And if we can narrow down some of this diverse suite of particles to the highest priority microplastics, it'll help us to do that more effectively. And then finally, direct and indirect monitoring of some of these potentially important point and non-point sources and additional transport processes is very important, and I think will be more important as we move into the future, specifically on wastewater treatment plant biosolids, land use specific runoff, even in-channel storage dynamics, which I didn't touch on much today, but we're seeing evidence that in-channel processing in these, particularly in our kind of ephemeral systems, can be really important. And then aeolian transport and depositional processes. So I've kind of set a lot of things up and then didn't talk a lot about the studies that we have underway because they're underway, and I don't really want to talk about our preliminary data yet. I've talked about some of our preliminary work in the Santa Ana River, but we have ongoing projects in San Pedro Bay and the major watersheds draining into San Pedro Bay as funded by the NOAA Marine Debris Program in partnership with our co-PIs at SQUIRP and in partnership with Orange County Sanitation District. We also have ongoing work in Newport Bay as funded by the State Water Board and in collaboration with Region 8 and with Orange County Environmental Resources. And then we're beginning pilot studies in collaboration with LA County Public Works to really investigate the opportunity to utilize some of their standing infrastructure to sample microplastics in ways that are much more efficient than our kind of full boogie research-based approaches. And so with that, I'll close it up, and I'm ready for questions if I have any time left. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. So I think in the interest of time, we're going to go to the next speaker, although I do want to entertain just one of the questions, and the rest, I think, Andy, if you could just fill those in the chat. So someone asked, you mentioned the high variability of the stream samples. We've seen similar variability when comparing samples using low volume, i.e. below 1,000 liters. Would it be possible to test whether volume is affecting the amount of sampling error, perhaps by sieving in situ, such as was done during the SFEI wastewater sample collection?
Yeah, that's an additional great concern, right? Because for natural sediment, oftentimes we're also introducing a pretty large amount of uncertainty through our sampling techniques. So, how certain are we that our sample that we've extracted from a flow is representative of sediment moving across the flow field? And this becomes probably even more problematic for microplastics because of the lower concentrations that we're dealing with and a broader range of particle characteristics. And so it makes all this it introduces even more uncertainty, and we would expect to see even broader ranges of concentrations. Yeah. So it's all the more reason to do some replicate work.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andy.
Great.
And I'm going to pass it back over to Shelley.